She built a quiet life from nothing, changed her name, buried her past, and swore her daughter would never know fear. For 7 years, Elena Ashcroft survived on borrowed peace, until the night black SUVs rolled through a storm and parked outside the only world she had left. The man who stepped through that diner door wasn't the one she remembered. He was colder, harder, and the moment her daughter's eyes met his, Elena felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. If you've ever run from something you loved, stay until the very end. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. The storm came in low and mean off the Atlantic, the kind that didn't announce itself with thunder but simply arrived, a wall of black pressure that swallowed the horizon and turned the evening sky into something bruised and lightless. By 6:30, the parking lot of the Tidal Spoon Diner was slick with rain, the neon sign above the entrance buzzing and flickering in a way it had been doing for 3 months, because the landlord was cheap and Elena Ashcroft had learned a long time ago that some things simply couldn't be fixed. She was pouring decaf for the couple in booth 4 when she heard it, the deep, low growl of engines that didn't belong to a place like this, not pickup trucks, not the rattling sedans that belonged to the fishermen who came in for the early breakfast. These were different. She didn't look up right away. She'd trained herself not to react to sounds. 7 years of that discipline lived in her spine like a second skeleton. But the couple in booth 4 looked. The man raised his eyebrows. His wife turned toward the window and pressed her lips together. 3 black SUVs, parked in a row like a wall. Elena set the coffee pot down carefully. She breathed. The air inside the diner smelled like fried catfish and old wood and the coconut hand soap she kept next to the register, and she focused on those smells the way she'd focused on ordinary things 1,000 times before whenever panic tried to climb her throat. It's nothing, she told herself. Wrong address, bad weather, someone rich passing through. Then the diner door opened. He came in out of the rain without hurrying, no umbrella. Suit jacket darkened at the shoulders from the wet, hair pushed slightly back, face unreadable in a way that wasn't natural. It was practiced, carved. The 2 men who entered behind him stopped at the door and didn't move further, and that alone told her everything about the kind of person he was, because ordinary men didn't travel with bodies that acted like furniture. Elena didn't recognize him at first. That was the honest truth, and it would haunt her later. She didn't recognize him because the Damien she'd known had been 31 years old with laugh lines and a tendency to talk too much when he was nervous. The man standing in her diner was 38 and looked like something that had been through fire and come out the other side without the softness that fire usually burned away. It left only the harder things. The jaw, the stillness, the way his eyes moved across the room in a single practice sweep, the way a man moves his eyes when he spent years in rooms where threats hide in corners. She was halfway to the counter before those eyes found her. She felt it before she understood it. A drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the storm, a sensation at the back of her neck like a cold hand pressing flat against her skin. She stopped walking. Her brain hadn't caught up yet. Her body already knew. Damien Vale stood 6 feet away from her and did not move. For a long, terrible moment, neither of them breathed. The diner was small enough that she could hear the rain against the roof and the couple in booth 4 murmuring to each other, and the faint sound of Patsy working the grill in the back. All of it felt thin, distant, like sounds reaching her underwater. His expression did not change. She made herself look away first. "Sit anywhere you'd like," she said. Her voice came out steady. She had no idea how. He chose the counter. Of course he did. She gave him 30 seconds before she turned back. He was sitting on the second stool from the end, both hands resting on the counter with a deliberate looseness that struck her as deeply unnatural. He was pretending to be relaxed. He was terrible at it, or maybe he'd simply forgotten how. She set a laminated menu in front of him without meeting his eyes. "Special tonight is clam chowder and grilled snapper. Coffee?" "Please." His voice was lower than she remembered, quieter. She poured the coffee. Her hands did not shake. That was the thing about fear. Real, deep, bone marrow fear. It didn't always look like shaking. Sometimes it looked exactly like competence, like a woman doing her job, pouring coffee. not dropping the cup, because if she let herself fall apart here, then everything she'd built over 7 years of science and sacrifice would collapse in a fluorescent-lit diner on a Tuesday night in a storm. He wrapped both hands around the mug and stared into it. She moved to the other end of the counter and punched in an order for table 2 with fingers that had gone slightly numb. His name was Damien Vale. She had not said that name aloud in 7 years. She had trained herself to think of him as him, or the past, or the reason, or nothing at all. She had been mostly successful. The nights were harder. The nights had always been harder. She had met him when she was 24 and working as a paralegal for a firm that did contract work for Vale Consolidated, which was the legitimate face of an organization that she hadn't understood the full shape of until 8 months into falling in love with the man who ran it. By then, it was too late to be smart about it. By then, she knew his coffee order and the way he slept on his left side, and the name of the dog he'd had as a kid, and the sound he made when something genuinely surprised him, which was rare. By then, she was already gone. She had not planned the pregnancy. She had not planned most of the things that had happened to her. She had found out 6 weeks before she ran. The running had not been her idea either, not entirely. She pushed that thought down hard and went to check on booth 7. Bumped. Lila was in the back booth closest to the kitchen, the one Elena always put her in during evening shifts. She had a booster seat and a coloring book and a grilled cheese that had gone mostly uneaten, and she was currently occupied with the plastic charm bracelet she'd gotten from a quarter machine at the gas station 2 weeks ago and had since decided was the most important object in the universe. She was 6 years old and the most exhausting person Elena had ever loved. "You need to eat 3 more bites," Elena said, sliding into the booth for exactly 45 seconds. "I'm not hungry." "You said that at lunch." "I wasn't hungry at lunch either." "Lila." "Mama, look." Lila held up her wrist. The bracelet caught the light badly. It was cheap plastic with little charms shaped like stars and a crescent moon and what was supposed to be a dolphin but looked more like a banana. "It's the prettiest thing I've ever had." 3 bites, Elena said. "Then we'll talk about the bracelet." She kissed the top of her daughter's head, dark hair, always slightly tangled no matter how carefully Elena combed it in the morning, and stood up. Lila had Damien's eyes. That was the thing Elena lived with every single day, the thing that was equal parts treasure and terror. Her daughter had her father's eyes. That particular shade of gray-green that shifted depending on the light, that steady, unapologetic gaze that looked at the world and simply decided to see it clearly. Elena had told herself for 6 years that no one would notice. People didn't go around cataloging eye color. It meant nothing. It proved nothing. She went back to the counter. Damien was still there. He had not touched the menu. His coffee was half empty. He was staring at the space above the pie display with the focused expression of a man thinking very hard about something and working very hard not to show it. She refilled his mug without being asked. "Thank you," he said. "Sure." 2 feet of countertop between them, 7 years of wreckage between them. She turned away before he could say anything else and took a dessert order from the couple in booth 4 and tried to remember if they still had any of the lemon tart left or if Patsy had eaten the last slice during her break, which she absolutely would have because Patsy had no self-control when it came to lemon tart and had admitted this freely and without shame. The rain got heavier. The neon sign buzzed louder. Damien ordered the chowder. She brought it. He ate it slowly, methodically, the way he'd always done everything, with a kind of unhurried precision that used to seem like patience and now seemed like something more calculated. She moved around the diner and tried to treat him like furniture and mostly succeeded until a sharp crack from booth 7 made her head snap up. Lila. On the floor. Reaching under the counter to grab the bracelet, which had evidently departed her wrist and rolled. Elena moved, but she was at the wrong end of the diner, and before she'd taken 3 steps, she registered motion at the counter. Fast, fluid, completely unself-conscious. As Damien stepped off the stool, crouched, and picked up the bracelet from beneath the far edge of the display case where it had spun to a stop. He straightened and looked down at Lila, who looked up at him with zero fear and absolute confidence, the way 6-year-olds looked at things before the world taught them to be careful. "That's mine," she said. I know, he said. His voice had changed. Something in it had fractured open. He held it out to her. She took it and immediately held it up to inspect for damage. Thank you, she said. Then, with the performative gravity that small children reserved for moments of great seriousness, it's very important. I can see that, he said. Lila examined the dolphin banana charm, satisfied, and looked back up at him. What's your name? Lila. Elena had covered the distance in seconds, and her hand was on her daughter's shoulder. Come on, back in the booth. Lila went, bracelet clutched in her fist, already forgetting him in the immediate and total way of children who had gotten what they needed. Elena settled her back in front of the coloring book and told her firmly that the next 3 bites needed to happen in the next 5 minutes, and then she turned around. Damien hadn't moved. He was still standing in the same spot, looking at the booth where Lila was already bent over her coloring book, and the expression on his face was the one thing Elena had hoped, desperately and without logic, that she would never see. He knew. Not the specifics. Not yet. But something in the shape of Lila's jaw, or the color of her eyes, or the way she'd looked up at him without flinching, had landed in him like a key turning, and whatever door it had opened, Elena could not shut it again. She walked back to the counter. She picked up the coffee pot. She breathed. Can I get you anything else? She asked. Damien turned back to her slowly. The expression was gone, sealed back behind whatever he used to seal things, but the damage was done. She could see it in the set of his mouth, in the way his hands, resting on the counter again, had gone completely still. No, he said. Just the check. She wrote it up. He paid in cash, large bills, no discussion, and stood to leave. She didn't watch him go. She heard the door open and felt the cold air from outside move through the diner and heard the door close again. She stood at the counter for a long moment. Then she went to the back, past the kitchen, through the storage room door, and stood among the industrial shelves of canned goods and paper supplies and dry pasta and let herself press both hands flat against the wall and breathe, really breathe, for the first time since he'd walked in. She had 30 minutes left on her shift. She did not know what she was going to do with the rest of her life. She rented the second floor of a narrow clapboard house 2 streets back from the water, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that got good morning light, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that was the only genuinely beautiful thing about the apartment and which Lila had claimed as her personal territory, conducting elaborate bath time rituals involving 3 rubber ducks and a waterproof book about undersea animals. The building's owner, an older woman named Mrs. Farrell, lived below and had never once asked Elena too many questions, which was the primary reason Elena had stayed. She put Lila to bed at 8:30. Lila negotiated for 8:45 and settled at 8:33 because she was practical about these things. Elena sat on the edge of the bed and ran her fingers through the dark hair until Lila's breathing slowed and deepened, and then she sat there for another 10 minutes because she needed to. In the kitchen, she poured 2 fingers of whiskey she normally didn't touch and sat at the table with her coat still on. 7 years. She had been so careful. The name change, Elena Ashcroft, was not the name she'd been born with. The distance. This town was 1,200 miles from the city where she'd been born. Loved him. Run. The job paid cash and asked nothing. Mrs. Farrell asked nothing. The school Lila would start in the fall was small and quiet and asked nothing. She had built nothing into a life, and she had been proud of it, mostly when she let herself think about it, which she mostly didn't. She pressed her fingers against the whiskey glass and thought about the way Damien Vale had looked at her daughter. She thought about the 2 men who had stayed by the door like furniture. She thought about the 3 black SUVs that had still been in the parking lot when she'd glanced out the window at 7:15, at 7:30, at 7:48, before they'd finally disappeared into the storm. She thought about the man she'd known at 24 who had told her once, very quietly, over takeout containers in his apartment, that he didn't lose things. That wasn't something he was built for. He hadn't said it as a boast. He'd said it the way someone described a condition, matter of fact, faintly resigned. She'd thought at the time that it was one of the truest things he'd ever told her. She finished the whiskey. She rinsed the glass. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the wet street below, at the streetlights reflecting in the puddles, at the ordinary dark. She started making a mental inventory of what she could pack in under an hour. She didn't sleep. At 3 in the morning, she was sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad, going through names and amounts. The small savings account she'd built over 7 years, the money she kept in cash in a fireproof box in the closet, the loose network of contact numbers she'd accumulated for reasons she'd always hoped were unnecessary. She wrote nothing down. She kept it all in her head, the way she always had. She tore the top sheet off the pad, blank as it was, and held it over the gas burner until it caught, then dropped it in the sink. Old habits. At 4, she went to Lila's room and stood in the doorway for a long time. Her daughter slept on her back with both arms out, fully committed to unconsciousness, rubber duck number 2 wedged beneath her chin. She had named the rubber ducks. Elena could never remember their names, which caused great offense. She watched her daughter breathe and tried to think about this rationally. He hadn't said anything. He'd paid and left. He didn't know. Not for certain. Not yet. A resemblance wasn't proof. A pair of eyes wasn't proof. Maybe she was wrong about what she'd seen in his expression. Maybe she was letting 7 years of waiting for the other shoe to drop warp her judgment. Maybe. But Damien Vale had not built what he'd built by ignoring his instincts. And what she had seen in his face before he'd shuttered it again was not uncertainty. At 5:15, she heard a car idle slowly past the building. She was at the window in 3 steps. Dark sedan, unfamiliar plates, moving at the pace of someone reading addresses. It rounded the corner and was gone. She stood at the window until the sky started going gray. She was not imagining things. The next 4 days were the quietest of her life in the worst possible way. Nothing happened. That was the thing that frightened her most because she knew what nothing happening meant. Nothing happening meant someone was being careful. Nothing happening meant patience. She picked up Lila from the afternoon childcare program at the community center and took different routes home. She noticed, on the second day, a car parked across from the diner that she didn't recognize. An ordinary gray compact that might have meant nothing except that it was there at 11 in the morning and still there at closing. On the third day, she saw a man she didn't know eating at the counter twice in one afternoon, ordering only coffee both times, and reading a newspaper without appearing to read it. She did not confront either of them. Confronting them would tell them that she'd noticed, and letting them know she'd noticed would tell them far too much about what she knew. She called in a favor she'd been saving for 5 years, a woman named Kit, who'd helped her disappear the first time, and who now lived in a different city under a different arrangement, and who picked up on the third ring and listened without interrupting. "How certain are you?" Kit asked when she'd finished. "Certain enough." "How much time do you think you have?" Elena looked out the diner window at the gray compact. "I don't know. A week, maybe. He's being careful. He doesn't want to spook me." "Can you move Lila without flagging it?" "I can try." "Then try," Kit said. "Don't wait for certain. Certain is usually 30 minutes too late." She hung up and went back to her tables and smiled at her customers and refilled their coffee, and spent the rest of her shift calculating distances. It was on the 5th evening after her shift that she found it. She was walking Lila home, the longer way, past the hardware store in the old fish market, adding 7 minutes to the route for no reason she could have articulated rationally, except that the direct route felt wrong, when Lila stumbled on an uneven piece of sidewalk and went down hard on both knees. No lasting damage, a lot of noise about it. Elena crouched and checked the scrapes and kissed both knees with the efficiency of a woman who had been doing this for 6 years. And when she straightened and reached for Lila's hand, she looked up and saw Damien Vale standing on the other side of the street. He wasn't pretending not to see her. He wasn't doing anything threatening. He was simply standing there with his hands in his jacket pockets, and when their eyes met, he didn't look away. She picked Lila up, all 44 stubborn pounds of her, and walked the remaining 3 blocks without looking back. She could feel him. That was the worst part. She could feel his presence at her back like a barometric pressure change, like the particular weight of the air before the storm came in. And she kept walking, kept her breathing even, kept her face from doing anything that would frighten her daughter. She put Lila to bed. She went to the closet and pulled out the fireproof box. She opened her laptop and bought 2 bus tickets under a name that wasn't hers and wasn't Lila's. She sat at the kitchen table with the box open in front of her and the tickets on the screen, and she told herself that this was the right move, the only move, The same move she'd made 7 years ago when she'd had 48 hours and a name to shed like a skin. She was still sitting there at midnight when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She stared at it. It buzzed again. She picked up. Silence on the other end. Then, "Don't run." His voice was exactly as she remembered it. Quiet. Certain. The voice of someone who did not make requests. "Please." She didn't answer. "I'm not here to take anything from you," he said. "I just need—" A pause. Something moved in his voice that she hadn't expected, something that cost him. "I need to know." Her hand was tight around the phone. Outside the window, the streetlights were ringed with fog. "Damien," she said, and it was the first time she had said his name aloud in 7 years, and it felt like pressing on a bruise she'd forgotten was there. "You being here, this is not safe." "I know." "You don't know. You think you know. There's a difference." Another silence. When he spoke again, his voice had changed slightly, pulled tighter. "Elena, what are you afraid of?" She looked at the fireproof box. She looked at the bus tickets on the screen. She thought about telling him. She thought about the 7 years she'd spent not telling him. She thought about the man who had come to her 4 weeks before she disappeared and told her very quietly and very specifically what would happen to her and to the child she was carrying if she stayed inside Damien Vale's world. She thought about the fact that that man had still been inside Damien Vale's world when she left. "You need to leave this town," she said, "tonight, and you need to not look for us again. That's not something I can do." "Then I can't help you." She hung up. She sat very still for 30 seconds. Then she closed the laptop, closed the box, and went to stand in Lila's doorway again, because that was the thing she did when the weight became too much. She stood and watched her daughter breathe and let that be enough reason for everything. Lila was asleep, both arms out, rubber duck number 2 in its customary position. She was still standing there when she heard something outside. Not the street, not the building, something closer. The soft sound of a step on the landing outside her front door, followed by silence, followed by nothing. She waited. Nothing continued. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the window and looked down at the street and saw, for the first time, that the gray compact was not parked across the street. It was parked directly in front of the building. And the man leaning against it was not one of Damien's men. She had never seen him before in her life. He looked up at her window. He smiled. Her heart dropped into her stomach like a stone. She reached for her phone. Not to call Damien, she told herself. Not for that. Just to have it ready. And her hands were shaking now, finally, in the dark of her kitchen, the composure she'd held for 4 days coming apart at the seams. Because the man on the street below wasn't watching her the way Damien's people had been watching her. There was no caution in it, no patience, no pretending. He was watching her the way something watches you when it's already decided what it's going to do. She didn't call the police. That had been her first instinct, and she'd killed it in under 3 seconds, because police meant questions. Questions meant records. Records meant names. And names were the one thing she had spent 7 years making sure did not exist in any official database attached to this address, this town, this version of herself. She stepped back from the window. The man on the street hadn't moved. He was still leaning against the gray compact with his arms crossed and his face tilted up toward her kitchen window with that smile that had no warmth in it, the kind of smile that was really just a message. And the message was, "I see you. I know exactly where you are. And I'm not hiding." Elena turned away from the window and moved through the apartment in the dark, not turning on any lights, using the layout she knew from 2 years of living in it. The step up into the hallway, the loose floorboard outside Lila's door, the bathroom door frame that sat 2 inches lower than it should. She pressed her back against the wall beside the front door and listened. The landing outside was quiet. She thought about the sound she'd heard earlier, that single soft footstep. She thought about whether it had been real or whether 4 days of surveillance paranoia had finally cracked her judgment. She stood in the dark and breathed through her nose and decided it had been real. Her phone was in her hand. She had Damien's number now. It had come in on the unknown call and she had memorized it without deciding to, the same way she'd memorized exit routes in every building she'd lived in since she was 25. She stared at the number and felt something she deeply resented feeling, which was the specific and humiliating sensation of needing someone she had spent 7 years refusing to need. She called him. He picked up before the second ring. "There's a man outside my building," she said. Her voice was flat and low. "Street level, gray compact. He was watching my window. He's not yours." A pause that lasted exactly 1 second. "Are you sure he's not mine?" "I'm sure." Another pause, shorter. "Is your door locked?" "Yes." "Don't open it. Don't turn on lights. I'm 4 minutes away." He'd already ended the call before she could respond, before she could tell him that she hadn't asked him to come, before she could explain that calling him had been a tactical decision and not anything else. She stood in the dark and waited and tried to make that true. He was there in 3.5 minutes. She heard the SUVs before she heard anything from the street, 2 of them, moving fast, cutting their headlights before they turned onto her block. She risked a look from the edge of the kitchen window, keeping herself against the wall, just enough angle to see the street below. The man with the gray compact had straightened up. For a moment he stood very still, and then he got in the car and was gone. Not panicked, not running, just gone, cleanly and quickly, in the way of someone who'd been told to withdraw rather than someone who'd been scared off. That distinction lodged in her chest like a splinter. 2 minutes later, she heard the knock at her front door. She already knew who it was. She opened it. Damien stood in the hallway with one of his men a step behind him. He looked at her the way she imagined a surgeon looked at a wound, assessing, measuring, filing away everything he saw. She became aware, in a way she usually didn't allow herself to be, of the fact that she was in the clothes she'd worn all day, that her hair was falling out of the elastic she'd put it in 8 hours ago, that she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who hadn't slept properly in 5 days. "He's gone," Damien said. "I know. You can't stay here tonight. I'm not going anywhere with you." He held her gaze. Behind him, his man was looking at the wall with the studied neutrality of someone paid to pretend he couldn't hear. "Elena." He said her name like it was something he'd been holding for a long time and had to be careful with. That man wasn't an accident. Someone sent him here, and it wasn't to watch you. That's a different kind of operation. She knew that. She'd known it from the smile. She just didn't want to stand in her own hallway and admit to Damien Vale that he was right about something. "Give me 1 night," he said. "1 secure location. In the morning, you can tell me to go to hell if you want." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him at the empty stairwell. "I need to get Lila." "I'll wait." She didn't argue further, which told her more about her own state of mind than she wanted to know. But Lila woke up confused and not happy about it. Elena packed a bag in 6 minutes. Clothes, the important documents from the fireproof box, Lila's rubber ducks because there would be genuine consequences if she didn't, and carried her daughter out of the apartment wrapped in a blanket, still mostly asleep, one hand fisted in Elena's collar. Damien was at the bottom of the stairs. He held the exterior door. Lila registered his presence through the fog of interrupted sleep and stared at him with the slow, suspicious scrutiny that 6-year-olds deployed when they were deciding whether something was worth waking up for. "You again," Lila said. "Hi," Damien said. Lila considered this, decided it was insufficient information to act on, and dropped her head back against Elena's shoulder. Elena did not look at Damien's face. She got in the SUV and sat with Lila across her lap and watched the town slide past the tinted windows and told herself that this was a tactical decision. She was utilizing an available resource. She was keeping her daughter safe. It had nothing to do with the fact that she'd felt for 4 days like she was standing on a frozen lake listening to the ice develop hairline fractures, and that the specific weight of being completely alone with that sound had been getting very hard to carry. The place Damien's people had secured was a house on a private road north of town, low, cedar-sided, set back from the lane by 200 feet of pine trees. Clean, well-kept. Nobody's primary residence. He told her none of that information, but she was able to deduce most of it from the way the house smelled. Recently aired out, recently cleaned, impersonal in the specific way of a place that existed for exactly this kind of situation. She put Lila down in a bedroom at the back. Her daughter went to sleep again with the unimpressed efficiency of someone who had decided not to let circumstances interfere with her schedule. Elena tucked the blanket around her and set rubber duck number 2 in its correct position and stood there for a moment before closing the door. In the kitchen, Damien was standing at the counter. He had taken off his jacket. There was a pot of coffee on, which she hadn't expected, and which she was not able to dismiss given the hour and her current state. She sat down at the table. He put a mug in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it and waited for him to say something she'd have to respond to. Outside the windows, the pine trees moved in a wind she couldn't hear through the glass. "The man on the street," she said first, because she'd decided she wanted to control the direction of this before he did. "How long have you known someone else was watching me?" Damien sat down across from her. "I didn't know. I suspected this afternoon." "What changed this afternoon?" "One of my men recognized a car that had no reason to be in this town. Plates traced back to a shell." He picked up his coffee. "I've been running a quiet investigation for 5 days. I was being careful not to spook you." He paused. "I was apparently not the only person being careful." Elena turned the mug in her hands. "Who are they?" "I don't know yet." "That's not reassuring." "I know." She looked at him directly for the first time since the hallway. Up close, in the flat light of the kitchen, he looked tired in a way he hadn't shown in the diner. A tiredness that lived deeper than the surface, in the lines at the corners of his eyes, in the set of his jaw. He'd been running hard for a long time. She recognized that particular exhaustion because she'd been carrying its cousin for 7 years. "Damien." She said his name again, and it was slightly easier this time. "Before you ask me whatever it is you're building toward, I need you to hear something." He held still. "I'm listening. Whatever you think you know, whatever you saw at the diner. You're going to wait until I decide to tell you. You're not going to ask. You're not going to investigate it the same way you're investigating the car. And if you can't agree to that, I'll take Lila and we'll walk out of here right now, and you'll have to make a decision about whether to let us go." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's not a fair arrangement," he said finally. "No, it's not." He looked at her. Something moved in his face. Not the thing she was afraid of, not the calculation she'd been bracing for, but something older and less armored. He looked for just a moment like the 31-year-old she'd known, before the years had done what they'd done to him. "All right," he said. She hadn't expected it to be that simple. She sat with it for a moment, waiting for the amendment, the condition, the quiet repositioning that men like him were famous for. It didn't come. "All right," she said. "Then tell me who could have found us here." He talked for 40 minutes. She listened without interrupting, which she could tell surprised him. He laid out what he knew with the precision of someone who had organized it carefully before sitting down. The shape of the operation that had been watching her, the resources it implied, the narrow list of organizations that had both the motive and the capability. He did not talk about the investigation into Lila. He had agreed not to, and he held to it, which she filed away without commenting on. What he described was not reassuring. The organization watching her had money and patience, which was the worst possible combination. They'd been in place before his people arrived, which meant they'd known about her for longer than 5 days, which meant the thing Elena had believed, that her disappearance 7 years ago had been clean and permanent, was wrong. "How long?" she asked. Her coffee had gone cold. She hadn't noticed. "I think they've known where you were for some time," he said. "I think they were waiting." "For what?" He looked at her steadily. "For me." The word landed in the kitchen between them like something dropped. Elena pushed her mug aside. "They knew you'd come looking. They knew that if something drew me here, it would be significant, something I'd want to protect." His voice stayed level. "They were patient enough to let me find you first, and then move." She stood up from the table. She needed to move, needed the physical fact of her own body in motion to process what he was telling her, so she went to the window and looked out at the dark pine trees and the narrow strip of lane visible between them. "So I'm the bait," she said. "I've been the bait for 7 years and I didn't know it. Not you specifically, the idea of you." He paused. "Whatever you represent to me." She kept her back to him. "You need to understand that I am angry about this." "I know. I built a life. I raised a child. I did everything right." "You did," he said. And the quietness of it, the complete absence of argument, made something tighten in her throat that she wasn't going to let become anything. You did everything right. This isn't a consequence of anything you did wrong. She turned around. Then what is it a consequence of? He held her gaze without flinching. Me, he said. It's a consequence of me, Maz. She slept 3 hours on the couch while Damien made calls from another room. She could hear the low murmur of his voice through the wall, not the words, just the cadence, that familiar rhythm of someone who ran things, who was always in the middle of running things, no matter the hour or the circumstances. At 7, she woke up to Lila standing directly in front of her face with the expression of a person who had been awake for some time and was confused about why no one else was. "Where are we?" Lila demanded. "A house. Good morning." "Is there breakfast?" "We'll find some." "Is that man here?" Elena sat up. "Which man?" "The one from the bracelet." She took a breath. "Yes. He's here." Lila appeared to process this. "He seemed okay," she pronounced finally, and went to investigate the hallway. Elena put her face in her hands for a moment. Damien was in the kitchen. He had found eggs somewhere and appeared to be in the process of making scrambled eggs with the focused expression of a man who did not cook regularly and was taking it seriously. Lila had installed herself on a bar stool and was watching him with the critical attention she usually reserved for television. "You're doing it too fast," she told him. He looked at her. "Excuse me?" "My mama does it slower, so it's fluffy." A pause. "I'll keep that in mind." Elena stood in the kitchen doorway and watched them and felt something she had no category for. Something precarious and painful and warm, all at the same time, like pressing both hands against a bruise and finding that it had already begun to heal and that the healing was its own kind of hurt. She sat down at the table and said nothing. Damien slowed down on the eggs. Lila approved. He put a plate in front of her with the same deliberate care he used for everything, and Lila ate with genuine enthusiasm, which was more than she'd shown for the grilled cheese the previous night, which Elena chose not to take personally. The call came at 9:40. Damien stepped out onto the back porch to take it, and Elena watched through the glass as his posture changed, the incremental hardening that moved through his spine and shoulders, the way his hand came up and pressed flat against the porch railing. Whatever he was hearing, it was not good. He came back inside 2 minutes later. "I need you to keep Lila in the back rooms for a while," he said. Elena was already standing. "What happened?" "My people picked up one of the surveillance team this morning, the man from outside your building." He kept his voice steady. He talked. "What did he say?" Damien looked at her directly. The steadiness was deliberate. She could see him holding it, making a choice to hold it. "The organization that's been watching you is an rival of mine. It's not external at all." He paused. "These people have been inside my organization for a long time. Someone gave them your location." The room went very still. "Someone inside," Elena said. "From the beginning?" "That's what I need to find out." She stared at him. Something was rising in her chest. Not panic, not the clean spike of fear she'd learned to manage, but something older and more complicated. 7 years ago, someone had come to her and told her she needed to run, told her that staying would kill her and the child she was carrying, told her specifically, in detail, what would happen if she didn't disappear. She'd believed him because he was one of the few people inside Damien's world that she had trusted. His name was Marcus Hale. He'd been Damien's closest lieutenant for 9 years. She had never told Damien. She had just run, the way Marcus had told her to run, because she'd been 25 and frightened, and he'd convinced her that telling Damien would only accelerate the danger. She had not spoken to Marcus Hale since the night he'd handed her a bag with new identification and a number to call in case of emergency that had turned out, when she'd finally tried it 3 years later, to be disconnected. "Damien," she said. Her voice came out strange, pressed flat by the pressure of what she was realizing. "What is your investigation? The one into who's been watching me. What names has it turned up?" He looked at her carefully. "Why?" "Just tell me." He was quiet for a moment. 3 names at the outer edge. We're still pulling threads. But there's one at the center that keeps coming up in the financial architecture. He stopped. She waited. Marcus Hale, he said. The kitchen seemed to tilt very slightly on its axis. How long? She said. Damien's jaw tightened. From the evidence so far? Years, possibly from the beginning. He paused, and she could see the cost of saying the next part. He's been running a separate structure inside mine for a long time, taking contracts, building something parallel. Elena's hands were flat on the table. She could feel the wood grain under her palms. She focused on that. I know why I ran, she said. His attention sharpened. What? 7 years ago, the reason I left. She looked at him. It was Marcus. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the pine trees outside had stopped moving. Damien's face went through something she couldn't fully track. Not anger, not yet. Something prior to anger. Something that looked almost like grief before it hardened into the thing that came after grief. He came to me, she said. He told me that staying would get me killed, that there were people in your world who would use me against you, and that you wouldn't be able to protect me because you wouldn't see it coming from the direction it was coming from. She breathed. He was very specific, very convincing. Damien had not moved. He gave me a bag, she said. Documents, money. He told me not to tell you, that telling you would accelerate the timeline. She paused. I believed him. I was frightened, and I believed him because he'd never given me any reason not to. She watched the thing in Damien's face complete its transformation. The grief was gone. What remained was very quiet and very dangerous in a way she remembered from a long time ago, the way a specific kind of stillness was more frightening than movement. He sent you away, Damien said. His voice was completely flat. Yes. And then he watched where you went. She hadn't connected all of it until this moment. She connected it now. The man who'd frightened her into running was the same man who'd built a surveillance structure around where she'd run to, who had watched her build a life and waited, who had known, apparently, that Damien would eventually find his way here, and who had positioned people accordingly. Marcus Hale had not been trying to protect her. Marcus Hale had been building a weapon. She was it. Lila was it. Damien was across the kitchen before she registered him moving, not toward her, past her, going for his phone. She caught his arm. Stop, she said. He looked at where her hand was on his arm and then at her face. Listen to me, she said, before you move on anything. Whatever you're planning to do in the next 30 minutes, stop and think about what he's expecting you to do. His jaw was tight enough that she could see the muscle working. He's inside my organization. He has access to everything, she said, which means the moment you move, he'll know. He's been watching you the same way he's been watching me. She held his gaze. He wants you angry. He wants you to react. That's what all of this has been building toward. Damien looked at her for a long, suspended moment. She released his arm. He put the phone down on the counter. All right, he said low. Then tell me what you think he's expecting. He's expecting you to come at him directly. He's been preparing for it. She thought about the man on the street with the smile that was really a message. He showed himself last night on purpose. He wanted to force a confrontation on his timeline, not yours. Why now? Because you're here, she said. Because you found us. He was waiting for the moment you confirmed whatever it is he suspected or knew about Lila. She stopped herself. But it was too late, and they both felt it. Damien's eyes met hers, and he didn't ask, just as he'd promised, just as he was still holding to despite everything she'd just handed him. He wanted to make sure you had something to lose, she said instead. And now he knows you do. Outside the front of the house, one of Damien's men knocked once on the door. Their signal, she understood from context, for an update that needed to be communicated in person. Damien looked at the door. He looked back at her. Something in the space between them had shifted irrevocably. Not toward each other, not exactly, but away from the 7 years that had been a wall, the silence that had been structural. The wall was still there, but they were both standing on the same side of it now. Don't go anywhere, he said. I won't. He went to the door. In the back bedroom, Lila's voice floated down the hall. She had found something to occupy herself with and was narrating it at some volume, the way she narrated everything, a constant, cheerful commentary on her own experience that Elena had always found equal parts exhausting and completely essential to the texture of being alive. Elena stood in the kitchen and listened to her daughter's voice, and to the low, rapid words Damien was exchanging with his man at the door, and felt the thing she'd been avoiding feel for 5 days finally settle into her chest with its full weight. This was not going to be manageable. This was not something she could pack a bag and outrun. This had roots. She heard Damien say a name, low and clipped. She heard his man say something that made Damien go very still. He came back into the kitchen. His face had gone to the place beyond readable. "What?" she said. "Marcus isn't at his residence. He isn't at any of his known locations." A pause. "He's been in contact with someone in the past 2 hours." "Who?" Damien looked at her steadily. "We don't know yet," he said, "but the call was made from a cell tower 6 miles from here." The bottom fell out of Elena's stomach. She was already moving toward the hallway, toward Lila's voice, before she'd processed the decision to move. She hit the hallway at a near run. Lila's voice was still coming from the back bedroom, that steady, cheerful narration, something about Rubber Duck. Number 2. Having an argument with Rubber Duck number 1 over territory, which meant she'd found the bathroom and was conducting operations in the sink. Elena pushed the door open and there she was, both ducks submerged, completely unharmed, looking up with the mild irritation of someone interrupted mid-diplomacy. "I'm in the middle of something," Lila said. "I know." Elena crouched to her level and kept her voice even. "We're going to stay in this room for a little while, okay? You and me." "Why?" "Because I said so." Lila looked at her with the specific expression she deployed when she knew that answer was not the real answer, but had calculated that pressing further would cost more than it was worth. "Can I keep the ducks in the sink?" "Yes." "Okay." Elena sat on the edge of the bathtub with her back against the wall and her eyes on the door and listened to the sounds of the house. Damien's voice somewhere near the front, the low frequency of his man's response, the wind in the pines coming through in pulses. She pressed one hand flat against the tile and let the cold travel up through her palm. 6 miles. Marcus Hale was 6 miles away. He had been 6 miles away when she'd been standing at her kitchen window watching a man smile up at her from the street. He had been 6 miles away when she'd called Damien. He had possibly been 6 miles away this whole time, watching the chess pieces move into position with the patience of someone who had been planning this particular endgame for years. She thought about the bag he'd handed her. New documents, money, a phone number that had stopped working. She had carried the weight of that gift for 7 years, the complicated debt of it, the gratitude she'd felt toward a man who had, she now understood, not been saving her at all. He'd been relocating her. He'd been moving a piece off one board and onto another. She'd run exactly where he'd needed her to go. Lila put Rubber Duck number 1 on the edge of the sink. "He's in timeout," she announced. "Okay, baby." He was being unreasonable. Sometimes people are. Botam. Damien came to the bathroom doorway 7 minutes later. He looked at Lila, who was now negotiating Rubber Duck number 1's release, and something moved briefly across his face before he locked it down. "My people have a vehicle on Marcus's last known position," he said. His voice was low, pitched under Lila's commentary. "We're 12 minutes from having eyes on him directly. And if he moves before then? He'll be followed." Elena stood up from the bathtub's edge. She crossed the small bathroom until she was close enough to speak without Lila hearing. "He knew we'd run trace on his call. He made that call intentionally. He wanted you to know how close he was." Damien held her gaze. "I know. He's pushing the timeline. Something changed." "Yes." "What?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had dropped further into the register she recognized as the one he used when he was saying something that cost him. "The financial structure we've been mapping. The parallel operation he built inside mine." A pause. "It's been liquidating for the past 48 hours. He's been moving money since 2 days ago." Elena processed that. "Before you arrived here." "Before I arrived here." "So he knew you were coming before you came." Someone told him I was tracking you. Someone in my inner circle. His jaw tightened. There are 4 people who knew I was running this personally. I've been narrowing it. Have you narrowed it? Getting close. She looked at him. You trust the people you have here? Right now, in this house? 2 of them, completely. 2, she said. Yes. That was a thin margin. She could see from his face that he knew it. She stepped back and looked at Lila, who had concluded rubber duck diplomacy and was now lying on the bathroom floor inspecting the underside of the sink cabinet with scientific interest. Lila, Elena said. What are you doing? There's a spider. Leave the spider alone. It's not bothering me. Lila. Fine. She stood up with the resignation of someone conceding a point she'd revisit later. At 10:20, Damien's phone went. He stepped into the hallway and Elena stayed with Lila and listened to the silence between his words, which told her more than the words would have. When he came back, his face was composed in a way that required visible effort. They found his car, he said. And Marcus? Not in it. She had expected that. She'd expected it, and it still felt like stepping onto a stair that wasn't there. Where was it? 3 miles from here, parked off a service road. He paused. There was a phone on the seat, not his regular cell. What was on it? One outgoing message sent 11 minutes ago. He held her gaze steadily. A photo. The temperature in the room dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the air. Of what? She said. Of Lila, he said. At her childcare program. Yesterday afternoon. The sound of her own pulse was very loud for a moment. She turned so that her back was to Lila, who had moved on to investigating the shower curtain with equal scientific rigor. He has someone at the program, she said. Her voice came out completely flat, which surprised her. Had. We're pulling that thread now. Who was the photo sent to? Damien was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was deciding how much to give her. She watched him make the decision. A number we've seen before, he said. It comes up in the financial architecture 3 times, always in connection with contract work, overseas contractors. He paused. Professional. The word sat between them. Professional meant not personal. Professional meant transactional. Professional meant someone had already paid for something to happen, and the photo was confirmation of a deliverable, and the deliverable was her daughter. Elena turned around. Lila had given up on the shower curtain and was now sitting on the bathroom floor examining rubber duck number 2 with a small frown, having detected something unsatisfactory about its beak. We need to move, Elena said. Yes. Now, not in an hour. Now. I know. He was already on the phone. They were in the SUV in 4 minutes. Lila had been picked up mid-sentence and handed her ducks and told they were going on a drive, which she accepted with the same pragmatic flexibility she applied to most of Elena's decisions, reserving her judgment for the ones that involved food or bedtime. Damien sat in the front. Elena and Lila were in the back. The second SUV followed. They moved north on the service road, away from town, away from the Cedar House, into the broader anonymity of the highway. Lila fell asleep in 12 minutes, her head against Elena's arm, the ducks clutched one in each hand. Elena kept her eyes on the road. Tell me what you know about the contractors, she said, low. Damien half-turned in the front seat. Eastern European network. They've been operating in this region for 2 years. Mostly corporate work. Industrial espionage, targeted pressure. Occasionally something harder. He paused. Marcus has used them twice before that we know of. Both times the objectives were achieved cleanly. What were the objectives? The first was a man who'd been talking to federal investigators. The second was a witness in a civil case connected to one of Marcus's side operations. She looked at the road. He's done this before. Used your infrastructure to run contract work. Apparently for years. And no one saw it. He was very careful. A pause. And very trusted. She heard what that cost him in the flatness of the last word. She thought about Marcus Hale as she had known him, the quiet competence of him, the steadiness, the way he'd always been the one in the room who said the least and understood the most. She'd trusted him because Damien trusted him. She'd trusted him because he'd seemed like a man who operated on principle, even in a world that largely didn't. She'd trusted him because he'd sat across from her at a kitchen table when she was 25 and frightened, and he'd told her with absolute conviction that the only way to protect the child she was carrying was to disappear. He'd been right about that. He just hadn't been protecting her. He'd been protecting his investment. The highway ran north through salt marsh and scrub pine. The sky was the pale, overwashed gray of a morning that hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. Lila's weight against Elena's arm was the only warm thing in the world. At 11:15, Damien's man in the front passenger seat received a message. He passed his phone back without comment. Elena read it. The childcare program. The person who'd been placed there to photograph Lila. They'd identified her. A woman who'd been volunteering there for 3 weeks, since before Damien had arrived in town, since before any of this had surfaced. 3 weeks. Marcus had known for at least 3 weeks. She handed the phone back. "He's known longer than we thought," she said. "Yes." "He didn't move for 3 weeks. He waited." She thought about that, turned it over. "He wasn't waiting for you to arrive. He was waiting for something else." Damien was quiet. "What changed 2 days ago?" she said. "Before you showed up, what happened in your world 2 days before you came here?" He turned to look at her fully. Whatever he saw in her face made him answer without the usual consideration. A federal inquiry opened, targeting the organization. Someone handed them a partial financial record. She felt the shape of it arrive all at once, complete and cold. Marcus handed them the record. "That's what we're—" "Yes, probably." He gave the feds enough to pressure you. Then he positioned himself as the one thing that could make it go away, because he controls the rest of the records, the parts that would either bury you or clear you depending on how they're presented. She stopped. "And he has Lila as insurance in case you decide to come at him directly instead of dealing." The front seat was very quiet. "He's not trying to destroy you," she said. "He's trying to own you." Damien's face had gone to the place she'd seen it go the night before, past anger, into that cold country on the other side of it. "Yes," he said, "that's what it looks like." "For how long?" "If the structure we're mapping is accurate, he's been building toward this for 6 years. 1 year after she ran. 1 year after Marcus had handed her a bag and sent her north and watched where she landed. She pressed her back against the seat and looked at the pale sky through the window and felt something that was not quite clarity but was adjacent to it. The specific sensation of understanding something completely for the first time after years of knowing it partially and wrong. "He told me," she said, "that night, when he gave me the documents. He told me there were people inside who would use me against you. People you couldn't see coming." She paused. "He was describing himself." "Yes." "He told me the truth. He just told it in a way that pointed me at shadows while he was standing right in front of me." "That's how he works," Damien said. "That's always been how he works. I just didn't—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't see it. I had every tool, every resource, and I didn't see it." She looked at his profile. He was staring at the road ahead, jaw set, and she could see the thing he was doing. The internal accounting, the itemized list of every moment he should have caught it and didn't. She knew what that felt like. She'd been doing her own version of it for 20 minutes. "Stop," she said. He glanced back. "Don't do that right now. You can do that later. Right now I need you thinking forward." A beat. He nodded once, short. He did. They stopped at a roadside motel 40 miles north, the kind of place with exterior doors and a front desk staffed by a man who asked no questions because the model of his business depended on no one asking questions in either direction. Damien's man paid cash. They took 2 adjoining rooms. Elena put Lila on one of the beds with the television on low, a nature documentary about sea otters that Lila approved of immediately and set about watching with critical attention. In the adjoining room, Damien had set up what passed for a command center, 2 laptops, a secure phone, and his 2 men working in the focused silence of people who understood that the situation had moved past the point of normal operating procedure. She stood in the doorway between the rooms where she could see Lila and hear Damien simultaneously. "The contractors," she said, Do we know where they're staged? Working on it. Marcus won't use them until he has to. He'll try to negotiate first. He'll want to talk to you directly. I know. He'll reach out soon, if he hasn't already. As if the statement had a trigger, Damien's secure phone lit up. He looked at the screen. He looked at Elena. She crossed the room and stood beside him and looked at the screen. Unknown number. But the text beneath the call interface, a message that had come in simultaneously through a different channel routed through 3 relays, read, "We should talk. Alone. The way we used to." M. She watched Damien's hand tighten on the phone. "Don't answer yet," she said. "I know. He wants you reactive. He wants you angry and reactive." "Elena." His voice was very quiet. "I am angry. I've been angry for the last 40 minutes, and I'm going to continue being angry. That's separate from whether I'm reactive." She looked at him. "Is it?" The question sat there. He set the phone down without answering the call. "What does he want from this conversation?" she asked. "To establish terms." "His terms?" "Yes." "Which means he'll show you something, proof of something, to make clear the position you're in before he tells you what it costs to get out." Damien nodded slowly. "What's the worst thing he could show you?" He was quiet for a long time. One of his men glanced up from a laptop, read the room, looked back down. "Evidence," Damien said finally. "Manufactured or real, it doesn't matter at this point. Evidence that places me personally at the center of everything he's been running under my name. He's had 6 years to build it. By now it would be convincing." He paused. "It would be enough." "Enough for the federal inquiry. Enough to put me away for a very long time, or enough to make me fold everything I've built and hand it to him to make the evidence disappear." She picked up the phone from the desk and held it out to him. He looked at it. "Answer it," she said, "but let me listen." He held her gaze for a moment, then he took the phone. He put it on speaker, low, and answered. The sound of a room, not a street, not the outdoors. Interior. Quiet. The specific acoustic quality of a well-insulated space. "Damien," Marcus Hale's voice was exactly as she remembered it. Measured. Unhurried. The voice of a man who had always known things slightly before other people did, and had arranged his effect accordingly. "I was beginning to wonder." "Marcus." Damien's voice was flat. "Where are you?" "Somewhere comfortable. Don't worry about that." A pause. "How's Elena?" The question was directed at the phone, but it landed in her chest like a fist. He knew she was listening. Of course he did. "Say what you want to say," Damien said. "I want to say a lot of things. I've been wanting to say them for 6 years." A breath. Something shifted in Marcus's voice. Not cracking, not emotional, but different in a way she couldn't categorize. "Do you know what it's like to run something for someone for 11 years and watch them get credit for every brilliant thing and blame for nothing? To be the architecture behind everything that works and the ghost behind everything that doesn't?" "You were compensated," Damien said. A short sound that might have been a laugh. "Compensated. Yes." Another pause. "I'm not calling to have that conversation. That conversation's been over for years. I'm calling because I want you to understand the position we're in so we can resolve it cleanly." "Tell me the position." "The federal inquiry has a witness, not a financial record. A witness. Someone who has spent time inside your organization and has been debriefed extensively." Another pause, longer. "The witness's testimony is detailed, specific, and largely accurate. The parts that aren't accurate are accurate enough that the distinction won't matter in a courtroom." The measured quality of his voice didn't change. "I can make the witness unavailable. I have the means and the relationship." Elena pressed 2 fingers against her mouth. "In exchange for what?" Damien said. It wasn't a question. A transition. Orderly. "You step back from active management of the primary operations. My name goes on the structure, legitimately, with your endorsement." A beat. "You keep everything personal. Your assets. Your freedom." "Elena." "The child." There it was. The child. Said plainly, without drama, the way you referenced something you'd already accounted for in the ledger. Damien's hand was around the phone so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. He said nothing. "I'm not unreasonable," Marcus continued. "I'm not asking for punishment. I'm asking for what should have been a conversation 11 years ago when you took something I built and put your name on it." The measured quality had something underneath it now, something that had been compressed for a very long time and had not entirely forgiven the compression. 48 hours. Think about it. Call me back on this number. The line went dead. The room was very quiet. Damien set the phone down on the desk with a precision that was its own kind of violence, the precision of a man suppressing the impulse to throw it. Elena lowered her hand from her mouth. She turned and checked Lila through the doorway, still watching the sea otters, lying on her stomach, ducks arranged in a row beside her. "The witness," she said, turning back. "I heard. Someone who's been inside. Someone debriefed extensively." She thought about it. Someone Marcus positioned there specifically, long before the inquiry opened. "Yes." "Do you know who it is?" He picked up one of the laptops. He typed something. He turned the screen toward her. She read the name. She read it again. "That's not possible," she said. Damien said nothing. "That's your lawyer," she said. "She's been your lawyer for 9 years. She has privilege. She can't testify to—" "Attorney-client privilege has exceptions," he said. "If the attorney was also participating, if the relationship was used to facilitate." He stopped. "She wasn't just my lawyer. Marcus has known her for 15 years. They were at the same firm before I hired her." Elena stepped back from the desk. Her legs felt slightly wrong. He had built this for years. He had placed people inside the structure the way you placed load-bearing elements inside a wall. Invisible, structural, essential. The lawyer who knew everything. The financial architecture he'd built and hidden inside the legitimate operation. The contractor's position close enough to use. The federal inquiry opened at precisely the right moment. The photograph of Lila sent at precisely the right time. And the woman who'd run 7 years ago and settled exactly where he needed her. Every piece had been placed. Every piece had been patient. She sat down on the edge of a chair because her body required it. "He has everything," she said. "Not everything." "Damien." She looked at him. "What does he not have?" "He doesn't have us in the same room," Damien said. "He's been operating on the assumption that the 7 years would still be between us, that we'd be managing our history while he managed his position." She thought about that. "He doesn't know that I told you about the night he came to me." "No?" "He thinks you still don't know the origin. He thinks you're working from financial records and speculation." She straightened. "He doesn't know how much of the architecture we've already mapped. We haven't mapped all of it." "He doesn't know that either." Damien looked at her across the small motel room. His face had changed in the last hour. Not softened, nothing like that, but something had shifted in the arrangement of it, in what it was holding, and what it had stopped pretending to hold. She thought about the 31-year-old she'd known and couldn't quite reconcile him with this man, except in the eyes, which were the same, and in the quality of his attention when it landed on her, which had always been total. "If I refuse his terms," he said, "he uses the contractors." "Yes." "And if I accept his terms, he still uses the contractors, eventually, because we know too much now, and he's too careful to leave that unresolved." She watched him arrive at the same conclusion she'd arrived at 30 seconds before he did. "Then there's only one option," he said. "We move first," she said. He nodded. "We need the contractor locations," she said. "We need to know who's been positioned and where before Marcus realizes we're not going to wait for 48 hours. I have people working—" The door to the motel room opened. Not the exterior door. The interior door. The one that connected to a third room she hadn't known was part of the arrangement. It opened fast and without a knock. And the man who came through it was not one of Damien's two. She knew him. Not by name, by face. The face of the man who had stood outside her building the night before and looked up at her kitchen window and smiled. He had a gun. Behind him, one step back, was a woman Elena had never seen. She was slight, brown-haired, holding a phone displaying something Elena couldn't read from where she stood. "Mr. Vale," the man said, in an accent she couldn't immediately place. "Mr. Hale sends his regards, and he wanted me to tell you that the 48 hours was a courtesy, not a constraint." Damien was very still. Elena looked at the doorway to the adjoining room. Lila was still on the bed, still watching her sea otters, back to the door, unaware. The man with the gun followed her gaze to the doorway. He smiled again. It was the same smile as the night before, and it meant the same thing, and Elena felt something happen inside her that she had no name for, something that burned out the fear and the calculation and the 7 years of careful survival and left behind something much simpler and much more dangerous, something that had been waiting a long time to be the only thing left in the room. She looked at the gun. She looked at the man holding it. She had spent 7 years keeping herself and her daughter alive through caution and patience and the practiced art of not being found. She was done with that now. She took one step toward the man with the gun, and Damien said her name like a warning, and she didn't stop. The man didn't expect her to move toward him. That was the only reason it worked. Elena closed the distance in 2 steps, not running, not telegraphing, just moving with the flat, committed momentum of someone who had already processed the cost and decided to pay it, and got both hands on his gun arm before he'd finished recalibrating from the surprise of it. She didn't try to take the weapon. She'd never held a gun in her life, and this wasn't the moment to learn. She just drove his arm up and sideways, hard, using her shoulder as a lever, and the gun went off into the ceiling with a crack that filled the small room completely, plaster dust raining down, Lila's voice from the next room rising in a single sharp note of alarm. Everything happened in the next 4 seconds simultaneously. Damien moved. He came off the wall with the contained explosive efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this half-second of disruption. No wasted motion, no hesitation, and hit the man with Elena's hand still on his arm, a collision that drove all 3 of them sideways into the wall. The woman in the doorway raised her phone, then changed her mind and went for something at her waist instead, and one of Damien's men, the one who'd been sitting with the laptop, was already across the room. And there was a second impact, a struggle Elena could only track in her peripheral vision because the man she was holding was trying to bring his elbow back into her face. She let go and stepped away. Damien had him. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't fast, but it was definitive. The man's gun was on the floor and Damien's knee was in his back, and the man's face was against the carpet with his arm at an angle that made Elena's teeth hurt just to look at. The woman in the doorway had been restrained. She was against the wall, her phone on the floor, Damien's second man's forearm across her shoulders, her expression not frightened but assessing, calculating, even now, the way someone calculated when they were gathering information for a debrief they planned to live long enough to give. The room smelled like gunpowder and drywall. Elena went through the connecting door. Lila was off the bed and pressed against the far wall, both ducks held against her chest, eyes very wide. She wasn't crying. She was terrified, but she was not crying, and Elena crossed the room and got down on her knees and wrapped both arms around her daughter and held on. "It was loud," Lila said into her shoulder. "I know." "What was that?" "It's okay. It's done." "Was that It's done, baby. It's done." She held her there for 30 seconds. Lila's heart was hammering. She could feel it through the layers of clothing, that small, rapid beat, and she pressed her hand flat against her daughter's back and breathed slowly and deliberately, the way she'd done 1,000 times to regulate both of them, until she felt Lila's breathing begin to sync with hers. "You're okay," Elena said. "I've got you." Damien appeared in the doorway. He looked at them. Something crossed his face and was gone. "We need to move in the next 5 minutes. They'll have been tracking this room." Elena looked at him over Lila's head. "She's not ready." "I know, we move anyway." She hated that he was right. Again, they were in the SU-5 in 4 minutes. Lila was in Elena's lap this time instead of beside her. She'd insisted with a grip that brooked no argument, and Elena had not argued. She sat with her daughter's weight across her legs and one arm around her and watched the motel shrink in the back window. The man from the room was in the second vehicle, restrained. The woman had given Damien's man a single piece of information before closing down completely. A location, 2 words, spoken with the blank affect of someone who had decided that particular piece of information was already compromised and therefore cost her nothing. Elena had caught the words through the doorway. Meridian Docks. She'd never heard of them. Damien was on his phone in the front seat, low and rapid. His left hand gripped the headrest, and she could see the tension in it. the knuckles, the set of his forearm. He was running 6 conversations simultaneously in his head. She knew that, distributing the situation across resources she didn't have visibility into, making decisions about people and positions she'd never know the details of. This was what he actually was. Not the man who'd sat at the counter of her diner with both hands around a coffee mug and a careful expression. This was the underneath. Lila had gone very still and quiet in her lap. Not asleep, not calm, just conserving. She did that sometimes when things were too big to process. She simply went inward and waited until the world became manageable again. Elena kissed the top of her head and said nothing. "Meridian Docks," Damien said, from the front, ending one call and moving to the next. "Industrial port facility, decommissioned, private purchase 3 years ago through a shell connected to Marcus's parallel structure. He owns it," Elena said. "He's been using it as a staging ground. My people found shipping manifests in the financial records. The facility has been active on and off for 18 months. He half turned. "It's where the contractors are staged. It's the operational center." "And Marcus?" "Unknown. But if he's planning to move today, if the 48 hours was theater, then he'll be there or close to it." He paused. "The federal witness. She's been moved in the last hour, away from federal protective custody and into an independent location." Another pause. "Meridian Docks is the most likely secondary location. Everything at one address." Elena turned that over. It was either very efficient or a trap or both, and with Marcus the answer was probably both. "He knows we'll go there," she said. "Yes. He wants us there." "He wants me there," Damien said, "on his ground, on his timeline, after he's demonstrated that he can reach us anywhere." He looked at her steadily. "He's been waiting 6 years to have this conversation. He wants to have it on his terms." "Then we change the terms." He held her gaze for a moment. "Working on it." Chats. They stopped again, 20 miles further north, at a property that belonged to someone Elena was not introduced to. A man who opened a barn door without being asked and disappeared back into his farmhouse without making eye contact. Inside the barn were 2 more vehicles, a cot, and a table with equipment that Damien's man immediately began interfacing with. Lila was set up on the cot with a blanket, and the Sea Otter documentary resumed on a tablet that materialized from somewhere, and Elena's daughter looked at the tablet, looked at Elena, and accepted this new development with the pragmatism of someone who had decided that the world made more sense if you didn't ask too many questions about the logistics. "I want crackers," she said. "I'll find some," Elena said. She found crackers. She brought them back and sat on the edge of the cot while Lila ate them and watched sea otters. And she stayed there until she was certain Lila had moved from the acute edge of fright back to the lower-grade adaptable uncertainty that was her daughter's natural operating mode. Then she stood up and went to the table. Damien was looking at a map of the docks facility. He had a pen in his hand that he was turning over and over without using. His 2 men were on separate phones. She looked at the map. The facility was large. A decommissioned commercial port with 3 main warehouse structures, a network of connecting service roads, and direct water access via 2 deep channel berths. Old infrastructure, plenty of cover, plenty of angles, the kind of space that rewarded whoever knew it better. "How many contractors on site?" she asked. "Our best estimate is 7 to 12. We can't be precise." "And your people?" 9, plus the 2 here." He paused. "Enough, if we're fast and if Marcus hasn't reinforced overnight." "You think he has?" "I think Marcus has been careful for 6 years. Reinforcing his position when threatened is consistent with being careful." She studied the map, the water access. "Can you come in from the channel side?" He looked at her. "You've been thinking about this." "I've had an hour." "Yes, we can come in from the channel. It splits his attention and it bypasses the road approaches, which he'll have covered." "Then that's how you go." "Elena, I'm going with you." The silence that followed had a specific texture to it. "That's not," he started. "Lila can't be here without me, and she can't be there with us, and she can't be anywhere unprotected." She held his gaze. "You need the people you have for the facility. I'm not taking your people and leaving my daughter somewhere with a number I can call if something goes wrong. I'm either there or I'm somewhere safe with her, and you just told me there is no somewhere safe." He held very still. "Your man can stay with her," she said, "the one who's been with you longest. I can see that it's him from the way you look at him. He stays with Lila and we go." She watched him weigh it. She watched him want to argue and find that the argument didn't hold its shape. "You do exactly what I tell you," he said finally. "The moment I say get down, you get down. The moment I say fall back, you fall back. No negotiations." "Agreed. I mean it. I heard you." He looked at her for one more moment, then he looked at the map. "We go in 3 hours," he said, "at dark." The 3 hours were the worst kind. Not active, waiting, which was harder, because waiting gave the mind room to construct everything it feared in detail. Elena sat with Lila until she was certain her daughter was genuinely asleep, checked that Damien's man, whose name turned out to be Roy, which was not a name she'd expected, was installed in a position where he could see all entry points and had Lila's cot in his direct sightline. Roy had a calm face and very old eyes and had said approximately 12 words in the time she'd known him, all of them useful. She trusted him in the way you trusted a barometer. Not because you knew it, but because it had consistently told you the truth about the pressure. She ate something. Bread, she wasn't sure what kind, standing at the table while Damien walked the space outside the barn with his phone, and she tried to get her heart rate below the threshold, where her hands felt electric. At 7:30, Damien's phone produced a call from a number she recognized from the earlier trace work. One of his people at the perimeter of the docks. She watched his face while he listened. When he ended the call, he stood very still for a moment with his back to her. "Marcus is on site," he said. "You're certain?" "Visual confirmation. He arrived 20 minutes ago." He turned around. His face had resolved into something clean and final, the expression of someone who had finished weighing and was now simply carrying. "The federal witness is also on site. Ground floor of the North Warehouse." "How do you know?" "Because Marcus wants me to know. He sent the confirmation himself to my secure line." He held out his phone. There was a message, a set of coordinates, and a single line of text that read, "She talks to the feds at 8 a.m. Tomorrow or she goes home. Your call. M. Her. The witness." Going home meant something specific, and it didn't mean a car to the airport. Elena handed the phone back. "He's setting the clock." "Yes. If we're not there by morning, we'll be there before morning." They went in at 9:40. 2 vehicles to the service road perimeter, then on foot through a quarter-mile of scrub and broken concrete in the dark. She could feel every piece of gravel through the soles of her shoes, could smell the salt and diesel that came off the waterfront in layers. Damien moved ahead and slightly left of her with the 3 other men who'd come in from the roadside. 2 more were coming from the channel, already in position, waiting for the signal. She had not been given a weapon. She hadn't asked for one. What she had was a phone with a secured channel open to Roy, who was at the barn with her daughter, and the explicit understanding that her role was to reach the North Warehouse and get the witness out while Damien's people managed everything that needed managing between the perimeter and that point. It wasn't a comfortable role. It was the right one. The docks at night were a different country. The warehouses were enormous at close range, 3-story industrial structures of corrugated steel and old brick, their windows dark, their loading doors rolled down. Sodium lights on tall poles threw orange pools at intervals, leaving long bands of complete shadow between them. The sound was mostly wind off the channel and the distant knock of something metal against something metal and the constant low breath of moving water. She counted the sodium lights and the gaps between them and stayed in the gaps. Damien's hand closed briefly on her arm. "Stop." And she stopped. 30 feet ahead, at the corner of the middle warehouse, a man with a jacket and a posture that said "professional" moved through a pool of light and disappeared around the corner. One of the contractors. He wasn't rushing. He was running a perimeter check on a schedule. They waited. 40 seconds. Damien moved. She followed. The North Warehouse door, a personnel door set into the larger loading bay, was locked with a keypad. One of the men had a device that took 11 seconds. The door opened. The smell of the interior was cold concrete and old machine oil, and something beneath that, fainter, that might have been recent habitation. Inside, darkness. Then shapes resolving. Industrial shelving, pallet stacks, the skeletal superstructure of old crane equipment. The floor was concrete, massive, their footsteps absorbed by the scale of the space rather than echoing, which was useful. Damien pointed. She looked. At the far end, through the structural grid of the warehouse interior, a light source. Not overhead, low, portable. The kind of light a lamp threw in an enclosed space. A room within the room. A partitioned office space built into the warehouse corner, its windows covered. She looked at him. He nodded. She went left. He went right with two men. The other man held the entrance. She moved through the dark along the warehouse wall, feeling for obstacles with each step, keeping the light source in her peripheral vision. Her heart was in her throat. Not the clean spike of acute fear, but something sustained and thorough, a full-body awareness of her own fragility in this space, of how much was riding on the next several minutes, of Lila asleep on a cot in a barn 20 miles north with Roy's calm eyes and old hands as the only thing standing between her and this place. She reached the partition wall. She pressed her back against it and listened. Inside, two voices. One she didn't know, female, low, tightly controlled. The other she knew. She had been hearing it in her memory for 7 years. Marcus Hale was speaking to the witness. He was not threatening her. That was the first thing that registered. His voice had the same measured quality it always had, the unhurried competence of a man who believed he had time, and he was laying out a sequence of events in the tone of a man explaining a contract. What she would say? To whom? When? The specific language of the testimony that would be most damaging, delivered in a way that sounded like her own recollection rather than a prepared script. He'd been coaching her. For how long, Elena didn't know. Long enough that the witness's responses carried no argument, only clarifying questions about sequence and wording. She had been turned, not threatened, turned. Whatever Marcus had offered her, she'd accepted, and she was now sitting in a partitioned office in a decommissioned dock facility at 10 o'clock at night, going over her testimony like a student going over material before an exam. Elena closed her eyes for 2 seconds. Then the door on the other side of the partition opened and the warehouse filled with light and noise simultaneously. The channel side team breaching the far loading door, the crash of corrugated steel throwing sound through the entire structure, and Damien's voice from the right side of the partition, clear and hard. Marcus. She went through the partition door. The office space was small. A folding table, 2 chairs, a battery lamp, file boxes stacked against the wall. The witness was a woman in her mid-40s with a lawyer's posture even sitting down, and she came to her feet at the breach noise with her hands flat on the table and her face showing the specific expression of someone whose calculation had just been invalidated. Marcus Hale was standing at the table's end. He was 62 and looked 50. He had always looked younger than he was, a fact that Elena had once found reassuring and now understood as simply another form of information management. He was dressed with the same quiet precision she remembered. Dark jacket, no tie, the understated presentation of a man who preferred to be underestimated in rooms where other people were performing. He looked at Elena, and something happened in his expression that was not surprise, not quite, but was the closest thing to it she'd seen on his face in 11 years of knowing him. Elena, he said. Marcus. Behind her she could hear the warehouse, movement, the professional controlled sounds of Damien's people working through the space, the contractor team either standing down or not. She couldn't tell yet from the sound. Then Damien came through the partition doorway, and the expression on Marcus's face completed its adjustment, going from that near surprise to something she could only describe as resolved. He had planned for this. He'd planned for everything. But something in the specific arrangement before him, her presence, the two of them, together, had landed outside the scenario he'd prepared for. You're early, Marcus said to Damien. You set a clock, Damien said. I moved it. Fair enough. Marcus looked at the witness who had not moved from behind the table. You can go, he said to her, with the courtesy of a man releasing an employee from a meeting that had concluded early. She's not going anywhere, Elena said. Marcus looked at her. You've gotten harder. You helped with that. A faint something at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, more like an acknowledgement. I did what I thought was necessary. I want you to understand that. I understand it perfectly, she said. You moved me where you needed me, and you watched where I landed, and you kept me there for 7 years as an insurance policy against a moment that's arrived about 6 years later than you planned. He regarded her for a moment. You always were the most perceptive person in any room. Don't do that. I'm not flattering you. I'm observing. Marcus. Damien's voice cut across both of them. He'd moved into the room now, fully in the lamp's light, and Elena could see his face clearly. Not the anger she'd expected, or not only that, something more complete. The face of a man who had spent 11 years trusting someone and was now in the same room with the shape of what that trust had cost. What did you think this ended with? Marcus turned to look at him. For a moment, something genuinely human moved across the managed surface of his face. Something that had been compressed for years under the weight of grievance and patience and the long-game discipline that had kept him building in secret for so long. I thought it ended with an arrangement that reflected reality, he said. I built most of what you run. You know that. You were compensated. Don't. The measured quality cracked, just slightly, just for a second before he recovered it. Don't say compensated again. We're past that word. The warehouse made a sound, something metallic from the far end, and all 4 people in the room reacted to it in their different ways. The witness flinched. Marcus's eyes moved to the door and back. Damien didn't move at all. Stand down, Damien said, without raising his voice, to no one Elena could see. A signal. To his people outside. But what came back was not confirmation. What came back was a sound she didn't recognize. 3 short impacts, heavy, like something being struck against a structural element. And then a voice she didn't know from outside the partition, speaking in a language she couldn't identify. And then silence. The silence was worse than the noise. Damien looked at the partition doorway. Marcus looked at the partition doorway. Something had gone wrong outside, and none of them knew yet what it was. And in the space between not knowing and finding out, the 3 of them stood in a lamplit room in an old warehouse and breathed. Then Marcus's phone vibrated on the table. He looked at it. He looked at Damien. He looked at Elena. He picked it up. His face, as he read the message, went through something she had never seen on it before in all the years she'd known him. Not guilt. Not the resolution she might have expected from a man whose plan was arriving at its culmination. Something else. Something that looked almost like the thing people wore when a variable they'd controlled for years had produced an outcome they hadn't accounted for. He turned the phone and held it out to Damien. Damien read the screen. He looked at Elena. His face had gone the color of old concrete, and she felt her stomach drop before she'd read a single word, before he'd turned the phone toward her, before the message had translated itself from light on a screen into the worst sentence she had ever read in her life. The girl is gone. Your man is down. We have her. Await instructions. The lamp on the table threw its small yellow light over the 4 of them, and the file boxes and the folding chairs and the entire world narrowed to the size of that screen and what was written on it. Lila. The phone was still in Damien's hand. Elena took it from him. She read the message again. She read it a second time because the first time her brain had refused to process it completely, had stopped at the girl and gone white around the edges, and she needed to read it all the way through with the particular cold attention she was going to require for the next several hours. The girl is gone. Your man is down. We have her. Await instructions. She set the phone on the table. She looked at Marcus. He was watching her with the expression of a man who had miscalculated something and was in the process of determining how badly. She could see it, the rapid internal accounting behind his eyes, the revision of a plan that had depended on variables behaving as expected. You didn't order this, she said. He held her gaze. No. Then who did? Silence for 2 seconds. In the warehouse outside, she could hear Damien's men moving, reasserting control of the space, the sounds of a situation being recontained after whatever had happened beyond the partition. There's a third party, Marcus said. He said it the way you said a thing you hadn't planned to say and had decided to say anyway because the situation had outgrown the plan it was built around. I've been managing a relationship, a business relationship, for 3 years. They provided capital for the operational structure, the contractors, the infrastructure. He stopped. And they want something, Elena said. They want the organization, not a piece of it, all of it. His jaw shifted. They've been patient. They were supposed to remain patient for another 6 months until the transition was established and I had the leverage to negotiate from a position. But they moved early, she said. They moved early. She looked at him. This man who had built a conspiracy of years and discovered that someone else had built a larger one around it, who had used her daughter as a variable and found that his own variables had turned on him. She felt something that was not sympathy, not remotely, but was adjacent to understanding, and she put it down hard because she didn't have room for it right now. Where would they take her, she said, if they're using her as leverage? Where is she? The second birth, he said. There's a vessel staged there, has been for 4 days. They were planning to use it for asset transfer, but if they've taken the child, they'll use it to establish an uncrossable distance. She was already moving. Damien caught her at the partition door, not grabbing, just a hand on her arm, 2 seconds of physical contact that said wait. And she waited because she knew he was right, even though every cell in her body was in the direction of the water. Roy, he said to her, I need to know about Roy. She'd forgotten Roy. She forced herself to process it. Roy was down, the message said. Down meant different things depending on who was writing the message and why. If they needed him out of the way to take Lila, they'd have incapacitated him, she said. Not killed him. A dead man generates different problems than an unconscious one at a location you're clearing. She held Damien's eyes. He's alive. I believe that. She could see him wanting to verify it, wanting the concrete confirmation, and not having time for it. Second birth, he said. South side of the facility. That's outside the perimeter we came in through. How long to reach it? On foot, through the facility, 4 minutes if nothing gets in the way. He looked over her shoulder at Marcus. If I use him to clear the way, too. She looked at Marcus, too. Marcus was standing with his arms at his sides and the expression of a man who had arrived at a very specific kind of reckoning. Not remorse, not yet, but the version of clarity that came when the structures you'd built started falling on you directly. You want me to make calls, he said. I want you to walk with us to that berth, Damien said, and I want every contractor between here and that vessel to know that the operation is suspended, that the terms have changed. I don't control the third party's people. You control yours. And some of his people are yours because that's how you built this. Interlocked, layered. You know which ones. He held Marcus's gaze with the specific quality of a man who was extending something at significant personal cost and needed it understood. Do this and we talk, afterward. You and me. Like we should have a long time ago. Something moved in Marcus's face. Not softness. Something older than softness and harder won. All right, he said. Dead. They went through this warehouse fast. Damien with 2 men ahead, Elena behind him, Marcus beside her with his phone making calls in a low and authoritative voice. The witness brought along because leaving her alone in that room was not a viable option. The warehouse interior was resecured, 2 contractors standing down with the particular blank compliance of men whose contractor had just countermanded their operational status. 3 of Damien's channel-side team falling in as they moved. Out through the loading bay and into the open facility, the night air coming off the water cold and sharp with salt. The sodium lights made everything orange and shadowed. Somewhere ahead she could hear the channel, the specific sound of deep water moving, heavier than surf, darker. She was running, not sprinting, not blind, running with her eyes open, tracking the ground, tracking the shapes of the structures they moved between, tracking the sound of Damien's footsteps just ahead, and using them the way she'd always used available information, as data, as anchor. Her lungs were burning already, and she didn't care. The cold was in her chest and she ran through it. The second berth was visible from 300 feet, a channel dock extending into the water, a vessel moored at its end, lights on below deck, a gangway down. 2 men on the dock who were not Damien's, who turned at the sound of approaching footsteps and had a half-second to make decisions about what they were seeing. Marcus spoke into his phone. One of the 2 men on the dock put his hand to his ear, listened, and stepped back. The other didn't move. Damien's man dealt with the one who didn't move in a way that was fast and non-lethal and got them to the gangway in under a minute. Elena went down the gangway first. Nobody stopped her. Later, she wouldn't be able to explain why she'd gone first. Not strategy, not assignment. Just the direction her body had committed to and everything else had organized around. Below deck, the vessel was a converted cargo craft. Narrow corridor, 3 doors. The first 2 open, empty. The third closed. She tried the handle, locked. She hit it with her shoulder. Old door, old lock, and she hit it twice more before it gave, and she stumbled through into a low-ceilinged cabin that smelled like diesel, an old rope, and found her daughter sitting on a bench bolted to the hull with a zip tie around one wrist fastened to a wall ring, and a man standing at the far end of the cabin who turned at her entrance with a gun already up. "Mama," Lila's voice, high and thin but not broken. Present. Elena's whole world reduced to 2 points, her daughter's face and the gun. The man with the gun said something in a language she didn't know. He was not one of Marcus's contracted crew. He was something else, something with a different organizational gravity, and his eyes were the flat professional eyes of a person for whom the next action was a calculation rather than a decision. She put her hands up. Not in surrender. In the specific language of hold on, wait, there's a conversation to be had here. She kept her eyes on his. "She's a child," Elena said. "Whatever this is worth to you, it doesn't require her. Look at her. She's 6 years old." The man's eyes moved to Lila. Something registered, not sentiment, more like a recalibration of the utility calculus. A 6-year-old was leverage only as long as the leverage was credible. A 6-year-old in a room with her mother who had broken through a locked door was a diminishing asset. She took one slow step forward. He recalibrated again, the gun steadying. Then Damien came through the door. The man's attention split for the fraction of a second that attention splits when a second threat enters a space, and Elena moved, not toward the gun, toward Lila, dropped to her knees in front of the bench and got her fingers around the zip tie, and pulled until it cut into her palms. And behind her she heard the specific compressed sounds of Damien and the man working through the mathematics of the situation rapidly and physically. She didn't turn around. She worked the zip tie. Her fingers were bleeding by the time she found the weak point in the plastic and bore down on it, and it snapped. And she pulled her daughter into her arms and turned her face into Lila's hair and held on with everything she had. It was quiet behind her. She turned. Damien was standing. The man with the gun was on the floor, restrained, the gun 3 feet away. Damien's left arm was at a slightly wrong angle at the shoulder, and he was breathing hard, and his face was the face of someone who had just done something costly and was in the process of deciding not to acknowledge the cost yet. He looked at Lila. Lila looked at him from the shelter of Elena's arms. Her eyes were wet, but she hadn't cried. That undid Elena slightly. The fact that her daughter had held herself together through this, had been frightened and restrained in a locked cabin on a boat and had not come apart. "You've got a really exciting job," Lila told Damien. A sound came out of him. Not quite a laugh. Something that a laugh lived inside, compressed and exhausted. "Yeah," he said. "I'm thinking of a career change." Well, they brought Lila up to the dock, and Elena sat on the dock's edge with her daughter in her lap and her back against a mooring post and let the cold come off the water and didn't try to do anything for several minutes except be in the physical fact of her daughter being present and whole. Roy was found 20 minutes later in the barn with a head injury that was serious but not critical. He was unconscious, his breathing stable. Damien's people called in a medical team with the efficiency of an organization that had pre-positioned this kind of resource, and Elena would learn the following day that Roy would have a scar and a headache that lasted 3 weeks and would make no complaint about either. The third party, the organization that had provided Marcus's capital and moved early, had 4 people on site. 3 were detained. 1 had gone into the water off the far dock and was recovered by the coast, hypothermic and disinclined to elaborate on his employer. The organization was, Damien's people would determine over the following days, a consortium of Eastern European investors who had been using Marcus's parallel structure as a point of entry into American operations, and who had made the strategic error of assuming that Marcus's leverage over Damien was more complete than it was. It was not the kind of error you got to make twice in their business, but they would not be making any kind of error again, because by the following Thursday, every legal mechanism available to a man of Damien Vale's resources would be in motion against them, and the mechanisms that weren't legal were already in motion before Thursday. Marcus sat on the dock, 20 feet from Elena and Lila, and made no move to go anywhere. He sat with his forearms on his knees and looked at the water and said nothing, and Damien's men stood near him without touching him, and that was where the night held for a while. At some point, Damien sat down on the dock beside Elena, not close, not touching, just present, his back against the same line of mooring posts, his injured shoulder held with the deliberate stillness of someone managing pain through immobility. Lila had fallen asleep across Elena's lap. The rubber ducks were in Elena's coat pocket. She'd found them on the cabin floor, escaped from Lila's grip at some point during the ordeal, and had picked them up without thinking. She could feel them in the pocket now, the small plastic shapes of them. The water moved. The sodium lights on the dock poles made orange circles on the black surface of the channel. "Your shoulder," she said. "It'll hold." "That's not what I asked." A pause. "Dislocated, maybe. Or close to it," he breathed. "I've had worse." "You should—" "Elena." He said her name the way he'd been saying it all night, like something that had been stored carefully and was now being used. "Let me sit here for a minute." She let him sit there. After a while, she said, "She held it together. The whole time. She was terrified, and she held it together." He looked at Lila's sleeping face, at the line of her jaw, at the gray-green eyes hidden behind closed lids. "She's yours," he said. "That makes sense." She felt the opening of the thing they'd been circling for 2 days. She didn't close it. "She's yours too," she said. The dock made small sounds. The water made small sounds. Somewhere in the facility behind them, Damien's people were working through a long and complicated night, and none of it touched the 10 feet of dock they were sitting on. "I know," he said. His voice had almost nothing in it. Almost nothing was still something, and she heard it. She looked at him. His face in profile, in the orange light, was not the face of the man she'd been afraid of for 7 years. Not because it had gotten softer, it hadn't, but because she was seeing it without the filter of 7 years of fear. And what she saw was a man sitting on a dock beside his daughter for the first time, holding a dislocated shoulder without complaint, and trying to contain what that was worth to him inside the boundaries of a face that had spent years learning not to show its worth. She reached into her coat pocket and put rubber duck number 2 in his right hand. He looked at it. "She'll want to know your name," Elena said. "Tomorrow, when she's had sleep and crackers and has processed everything at her own pace. She'll want to know your name and she'll want to know who you are." He held the duck. He looked at it with the expression of a man holding something small and breakable that he very much did not want to break. "What do I tell her?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. "The truth," Elena said. "Simplified. She's 6, not 4. She can hold more than people think." She paused. "You tell her your name, and you tell her you've been looking for her and that you found her and that you're not going anywhere." He was quiet for a long time. "And if she doesn't want that," he said, "if she's not, then you give her time and you don't push and you let her set the pace." Elena looked at her daughter's sleeping face. "That's what you do when you love someone who isn't ready. You don't make them ready. You just stay available and you let it happen at the speed it happens." He nodded. Slowly, like a man filing instructions he intended to follow exactly. The conversation with Marcus happened at dawn, on the dock, with the sky going from black to the washed gray of very early morning and the channel surface turning from oil dark to something closer to pewter. Elena was present because she had decided to be, and neither man argued. Marcus looked older in daylight, not physically. He still had that quality of looking younger than he was, but in some other register, some layer of presentation that had held perfectly through the night and was now showing, in the gray morning, its actual age. How long were you planning it? Damien said. Not angry? Not yet. Operating in the flat zone before anger had enough energy to sustain itself. I stopped planning and started building around year 4, Marcus said. The planning started before that. Year 4. Damien's jaw moved. We were in the middle of the hardest expansion we'd ever run. You were the only person I could trust to hold the Eastern operations. I know. I needed you. I know that too. Marcus looked at the water. That's part of what made it easy. Being needed is a good cover for building something parallel. You don't look too closely at the load-bearing wall. Elena watched Damien absorb this. The night you sent Elena away, he said. Did you consider what that cost? Marcus was quiet for a moment. I considered what it gave me. That's not the same question. No. He looked at his own hands. It's not. A pause, longer. I told myself it was cleaner for her, that I was genuinely moving her somewhere safer. I've told myself that for 7 years, and I've gotten better at believing it, and worse at believing it in approximately equal measure. You watched where she went, Elena said. Her voice came out even. She'd worked to make it even. You watched for 7 years and you kept her location as a card you could play. He looked at her. Yes. And Lila, she said, you knew. From approximately 8 months after she was born, I had people in enough places. He held her gaze. He stopped, started again. I never intended to use the child directly. That was the third party acting outside the parameters I'd established. That's a very careful distinction, she said. Yes. It doesn't hold a lot of weight. No, he said. It doesn't. Damien stood up from the mooring post he'd been leaning against. His shoulder made the movement cost something. She could see it in the line of him, the compression through his torso. He stood and looked at Marcus for a long moment. You built half of what I have, he said. That's true. I should have acknowledged it differently. I should have had that conversation with you 10 years ago. He paused. And none of that accounts for a single thing you did, and we're not going to pretend it does. Marcus looked at him. The federal witness, Damien said. She'll recant. Whatever she was going to say, it doesn't happen. You make that right. I can do that. The financial records you've been holding, all of them. You produce them, to my people, today. A pause. That removes my leverage. Yes. Marcus looked at the water. He looked at the gray sky. He looked like a man measuring what he had left against what he was being asked to give away, and finding that the measurement came out differently than it would have come out 24 hours ago, before the night had taken the shape it had taken. All right, he said. And then, Damien said, you and I are done. You don't contact me. You don't contact Elena. You don't build anything that points in our direction. You take whatever you've got left, and you put distance between it and us, and you don't mistake that distance for safety. He held Marcus's gaze with a directness that had nothing performative in it. Because if I ever have cause to look at you again, I will look very thoroughly. Marcus held the gaze. He nodded once. No handshake. No formality. Just the acknowledgement of two men who had known each other for 11 years and were now done knowing each other, and the weight of that being exactly what it was. Not nothing, not quite grief, but something that lived in the same county as both. The witness, her name was Carla Rain, and she had been Damien's corporate attorney for 9 years and Marcus's leverage for 3. Sat in a room at a secured location with 2 of Damien's people and made a phone call to the federal inquiry's lead investigator at 7:45 in the morning. Elena didn't hear the call. She heard the summary afterward. Carla Rain had reconsidered the substance and reliability of the testimony she'd been prepared to give and was withdrawing from the process. The inquiry would continue in attenuated form for several more months before concluding that the financial records, now fully produced and accurate, reflected an operation in which Damien Vale had been the subject of internal fraud rather than its architect. It was a slow and unsatisfying conclusion for everyone involved, which was usually what justice looked like from the inside. Damien spent the morning making calls and the afternoon in a hospital with his shoulder, which turned out to be not quite dislocated, but close enough that the distinction was academic. He emerged with his arm in a sling, and the expression of a man who had been told to rest and had already decided how much of that advice he intended to take. Lila, who had processed the previous night's events in the way of 6-year-olds, completely, rapidly, and by moving on to the next available point of interest, had a great many questions about the hospital. About the sling specifically, about whether it hurt and whether you could still drive with it and whether there would be a scar. Damien answered all of them. Elena sat in the waiting area of the hospital and watched them through the glass partition, her daughter in a plastic chair beside a man in a sling, asking questions at volume, the rubber ducks lined up on the seat between them, and felt something complete itself in her chest, something that had been incompletely assembled for years and had simply needed the right pieces to be present in the same room at the same time. She went back to the apartment above Mrs. Farrell's house. Not immediately, not that day. It took a week to establish that the threat had been dismantled thoroughly enough, that the third party had been neutralized, that the contracted operatives had been dealt with through channels that were partly legal and entirely effective. A week of a different kind of safe house, this one less barn and more a rented property on a quiet road, where Lila attended to her rubber ducks and her sea otter documentary and her ongoing assessment of Damien Vale, which was conducted with the patient empiricism of a scientist in no hurry to reach a conclusion. When Elena went back to the apartment, she packed it. Mrs. Farrell was in her doorway when they carried boxes down. She watched with the expression of a woman who had suspected for 2 years that the tenant upstairs was more complicated than she'd presented, and had chosen not to ask about it. "You'll be all right?" Mrs. Farrell said. "Yes," Elena said. And then, because it was true, and because Mrs. Farrell had given her 2 years of no questions and deserved something in return, "Better than all right, I think." Mrs. Farrell nodded. She looked at Lila, who was carrying rubber duck number 1 down the steps with the solemnity of transporting something valuable. She looked at Damien, who was carrying 2 boxes and navigating the narrow staircase with a sling that was now technically optional but still present, because the hospital had said 2 more weeks and he was, in this one specific area, listening. Mrs. Farrell went back inside without saying anything else, which was, Elena thought, its own kind of eloquence. The Title Spoon Diner was still there. Of course it was. It was the kind of place that absorbed events and kept going. The fluorescent lights buzzing slightly over the counter, the neon sign in the window with its chronic electrical unreliability, the smell of fried catfish and coconut soap that lived in the wood of the place, the way all accumulated years lived in wood. Elena did not quit. She thought about it and decided against it, because the diner was not the problem and never had been, and she was done making decisions based on what the problem was adjacent to. She went back on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the night at the docks. She put on her apron and picked up the coffee pot and poured decaf for the couple in booth 4, who had never known anything was wrong, and showed her photographs of their grandchildren, and she stood at the counter between orders and looked at the parking lot and did not feel afraid. That was new. That was worth noticing. Damien came in at 6. Not with the black SUVs, not with the men who stood like furniture at the entrance. He came in from the parking lot in a jacket with the sling finally gone, his shoulder healed to the degree that he'd accept, and he sat down at the counter on the second stool from the end the way he had on a stormy Tuesday 3 weeks ago, and he put both hands around the coffee mug she set in front of him. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The diner was quiet. 2 other tables, Patsy working the grill with the radio on low. "How's the shoulder?" she said. "Good. You're not wearing the sling." The sling was advisory. The doctor said 2 weeks. "It's been 13 days. She looked at him. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. "Close enough," she said. She refilled his coffee, even though it didn't need it, and moved down the counter and took an order and came back. And that was how the evening went. Him at the counter, her working around him, the ordinary texture of the diner doing what ordinary things did, which was hold its shape and let life happen inside it. At 7, she heard the back door, Lila coming in from the booth she'd been stationed in, carrying rubber duck number 2 and a coloring book, and the absolute certainty of someone who had somewhere to be. She climbed up onto the stool beside Damien. She put rubber duck number 2 on the counter. "I named the ducks," she told him. "You mentioned them," he said. "This one is Gerald." She presented Gerald. Damien examined Gerald with appropriate gravity. "The other one is Gerald also." A pause. "Both of them?" "I changed my mind about names." She appeared unconcerned by any inconsistency this created. "Do you have a middle name?" "James," he said. Lila considered this. "Damien James." "That's correct." She considered him further, with the patient assessment that had been ongoing for 2 weeks and appeared to be reaching some kind of interim conclusion. "My mama says you're going to be around more." He looked at Elena briefly. "That's the plan." "Do you know how to play card games?" "Some." "I'll teach you the ones I know," she said, with the magnanimity of someone distributing a significant gift. "They're not hard." "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said, apparently satisfied, and turned to her coloring book, and Gerald sat on the counter between them in the buzzing fluorescent light of the diner, and Elena stood on the other side of the counter and watched the two of them, her daughter coloring, her daughter's father sitting very still with both hands around a coffee mug, as if stillness was the best thing he could offer this particular moment, as if he understood that some things were not seized or managed or built, but simply arrived in, carefully and without agenda. He looked up at her. She looked back. Outside, the parking lot was empty in the way of ordinary evenings. Nobody watching, nobody staged, nobody with a smile that was a message. Just the orange light of the street lamps on wet asphalt, and the sound of the Atlantic somewhere behind the town, the constant patient sound of it, moving the way it had always moved, indifferent to everything that had happened on the shore, outlasting all of it. She picked up the coffee pot. She poured. That was all. That was enough. That was the whole of it. The ordinary fact of a diner on a Thursday evening, 2 people across a counter, and a child drawing something with great concentration in a coloring book, and the simple, costly, hard-won weight of everyone in the room being exactly where they were, in no danger, in no hurry, finally, without anywhere to run.